Clark, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here with y'all today. I've really enjoyed the last several days. I've been inspired by what I've heard about the things that you're doing to make a difference, to bring electricity to the remote parts of the world, places where people have no access. You know, I have long believed that facts make people believe, but stories make people care. And I've heard a lot of wonderful stories over these days. And when I came here caring, I'll leave here caring even more based on the stories that I've heard from y'all over the last several days. Now let me tell you what I'm going to try to do this morning, and I'm going to work hard to leave time for us to have a conversation about it. Because I believe that all knowledge starts with a conversation. And so hopefully we can get to that place. And what I'm going to try to do is sketch out kind of in a general way the challenge of energy poverty and energy access. Then I'm going to digress and turn to how the electrification of America occurred for the prime purpose of asking the question, is there anything in how that happened that could be a lesson that we could use in bringing electricity to remote areas around the world? So, and then I'll come back and I have a few questions I want to throw out to the group to talk about these issues. Let me start by recapping kind of a few facts that y'all have heard. One is that there's 1.2 billion people that have no access to electricity. We all know that. But not as many people know that there's 1 billion people who are connected to the grid, but have unreliable, unpredictable sources of electricity. Hard to run a business, hard to plan a life if you're in that situation. Now that's a challenge for another day, but we can't forget it because at the end of the day, having adequate access to electricity is really key to success for communities. You know, and the thing that's really struck me as I've studied this, as Clark said, I spent most of my career running a large utility in the US, but I also did business in 17 countries during that time, making investments in these countries. But I've been amazed at the blind spot that people have about energy poverty. I mean, think about it. The UN was slow to recognize the challenge. When they did the millennial goals in 2000, they didn't really address energy poverty. Only 15 years later, with the Sustainable Development Goals, energy access is number 7 on that list. But there's a blind spot at the World Bank, at development banks, at local banks. And that blind spot is, look at the allocation. Simon did a good job of showing the chart, but look at the allocation of the capital to rural electrification compared to central station plants in urban areas. Primarily, all the money goes to central station plants and goes to urban areas around the world. Now you go, well, why is such a blind spot? And I think the reason is electricity is ubiquitous in our lives, particularly if you live in a high-income country. Now, I don't use developed or developing. I think that's pejorative to talk about countries that way. I think it's more descriptive to say there are high-income countries and low-income countries, because it allows you to get into the conversation in a better way with everybody if you approach it that way. And as I look at the 1.2 billion around the world, I may be most alarmed by the 630 million in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason I'm alarmed is because I look at how fast they're moving on electrification, and then I look at the birth rate, And I believe that the birth rate is going faster than electrification, which means by 2030, there'll still be 630 million, maybe more people without access to electricity. So to me, the key is the ability to accelerate the deployment of the technologies that we have today and technologies on the horizon to these various areas. The last thing I will say is I have a belief that access to electricity is a basic human right. If the UN found it a basic human right, governments and countries around the world would approach it differently. In the same way when they decided that water and sanitation was a basic human right, countries started addressing the issue in different ways and allocating resources in a different way. So I don't know how you feel about that, and we'll have a conversation with it as I wrap up, but I think that is an important initiative that needs to be completed. In the last 2 weeks, I've spent in East Africa. I'm also on the global board of the Nature Conservancy, and I was working on conservancy issues. I was near Lake Tanganyika in the most western part of Tanzania, and we were there to talk about sustainable fisheries. But the people were interested in how can you provide solar electricity to us? Yeah, they want the fisheries to work in a sustainable way. And then there were, in that area, there were 3 villages. There was probably 12,000 people in those villages. And the reason they felt it, the urgency to solve it, I mean, we didn't bring it up, they brought it up. And the reason they have a great sense of urgency is because 3 of their homes had burned down from the use of kerosene. And recently. So they had a kind of a real sense of urgency about addressing the issue. And while I was there on TNC business, I took time to visit, and Simon talked about them, Mcopa Solar. Now that's a company that I think has got the model right. In a short period of time, they provided electricity to over 600,000 people. They have the pay-as-you-go model, and it really is only possible because of the convergence of several technologies. You got solar, you got smartphones or cell phones, you've got the internet, and you have mobile banking. If you bring all those technologies and capabilities together, that underpins their business model. And I felt so strongly about it that I made a personal investment in the company because I believe it's the best model that I've seen. And I contrast for a moment, because I spent a lot of time in Tanzania, 8% of the people have electricity in Tanzania. 40% of the people have electricity in Kenya. And yet the Tanzanian government basically put a tax on new solar panels and on solar lanterns and other solar devices, essentially putting a company out of business called Off-Grid Electric, which has been funded by Elon Musk. And he's sort of packed up and left Tanzania and going to other places in Africa. Because the government, I mean, it's kind of almost hard for me to imagine that only 8% of the people have electricity, and the government's making it more difficult to bring light to the people in the rural areas of the country. I think it's just wrong at so many different levels. I think the other thing that I saw, I mean, there's 90% of the people in Kenya and Tanzania, I mean, East Africa is kind of a little different than all of Africa, have cell phones. And if they have cell phones, they need to charge them. And actually, one of the things that motivated me to really focus in this area, I was in a village where I discovered a guy had no electricity. And this was back in 2010. He had a cell phone. I say, how do you charge it? He says, I walk 3 hours to charge it. I pay somebody to let me get it charged, and then I walk back. Now think about, what if he could use that time working? What if he could use that time with more education? How would that change his life and the life of the people in the village if they actually had access to electricity? Because in a sense, it frees up time for people to focus on more productive areas in their life. Now, let me quickly list what I believe I heard over the last 2 days. And maybe I'm listing them in this way because it fits with what I believe when I walked in here. You know, we all do a little bit of that. We have our own biases and we tend to make things fit into our biases. But I believe there are 4 major impediments to providing electricity. One is government policy. You know, it's not what the government does, like in Tanzania, to make it more difficult and less affordable to get electricity, but it's governments that do nothing. And what I mean by that is they don't pass legislation that facilitates the deployment of electricity in rural areas. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. I think the number 2 impediment is financing. And I think we've got to figure that out. Because local banks in most low-income countries don't have the capability to loan money, to assess the risk. The development banks haven't been focused in this area, so it's really critical, in my judgment, to have development banks working with local banks to create the capability to loan money in these remote areas to drive the business. The other thing that's an impediment, and number 3 on my list, is capability to pay. There's limited capability to pay in many of these areas. And lastly is technology. You know, we've heard some great discussions about technology, and I think technology is going to be there. It's coming fast. And so that, to me, is the lesser of all these impediments to making it happen. And maybe I didn't put on the list, but it occurs to me, it's really human capability to work in this area, to work in the villages. And I'm telling you, it's hard. I mean, this Global BrightLight, we're primarily today, after putting a lot of our solar lanterns, 75,000, primarily in refugee camps historically. But now our focus is really more on Guatemala, where there's 3 million people, most of them in the northern part of the country. Most of them are Mayan areas. And so it's, to get there, it costs about 50% the cost of our solar lantern and our pay-as-you-go system just to get there and deliver it and build the relationships within the community, to recruit the people, to engage them, to empower them, and to really have the capability to make it happen. And by the way, not everybody wants electricity. I mean, I've spent time with Samburu tribes, and they're very nomadic, and they have no desire for electricity. And I'm going, really? And I kind of tried to convince them, but then I realized I wasn't convincing them. And when you realize that, you kind of back away. Now, what I want to do now, and I want to do kind of a Pony Express version of this, I want to turn and look at electrification of America and say, are there any lessons in there that help us? If you go back to the early, actually 1893, when they had the World's Fair in Chicago, there was a great battle between, are we going to use AC or DC current? And at the end of the day, Westinghouse beat Edison. Edison was advocating DC, but we adopted AC current. And that became the start of how we rolled out electricity in this country. But here's a really important insight. We started in America with mini grids. We didn't call them mini grids then. Little municipalities, little areas with a power plant nearby, small power plant, and they provide electricity in these areas. It was pretty unreliable. It was fairly high cost. And the consequence of that is people said, we got to make it affordable. If there's any theme in the 20th century in the electrification of America, it's the theme of affordability. Everything that was done was to drive the cost down so people could pay for it. And the only service that we really had to provide at that time was lighting. That was the only service. And so the whole, I mean, it's not different than how we think about some of these villages. in a remote area. What's the right place to start? But here's what happened. There started to be a consolidation of all these mini grids. And they started building bigger power plants, and bigger power plants, and bigger power plants. And why did they do that? One, there was a demand for the power, but more importantly, the unit cost of electricity kept going down. Now by 1960, we were building 800 megawatt plants and 1,000 megawatt plants, but we had reached a point where the unit costs didn't keep going down. So we'd kind of come to the end of bigger and bigger plants bringing unit costs down. So that kind of started to move us in a different direction. But here's an important part about this history. The industry, investor-owned utilities, co-ops, munis, they had to embrace new technologies. New technologies in terms of building bigger plants, new technologies in terms of, they started with hydro, they built coal, they embraced nuclear, and then natural gas came along in the 60s and the 70s, and then renewables came along. There's kind of a belief in America that utilities don't support renewables. But 100% of the wind in the United States is either owned by or contracted for by utilities. And 60% of solar is owned by or contracted for by utilities. So they have consistently moved to new technologies. They've been slow movers, slow adopters, because they have an eye on affordability, and they look at when the cost curve comes down on a new technology to pick the place, not the first day when the price is high, but later as the price continues to go down. And I guess, and let me just stop here and talk about co-ops, because this is a really important point for rural electrification. In 1930, only one farm out of every 10 in America had electricity. 1 out of 10. Because investor-owned utilities, it wasn't economical to build a line out to a farm or out to these distant rural areas. And so the government passed the Rural Electrification Co-op Act, and that basically allowed the government to stand behind every co-op in terms of when they borrowed money, they guaranteed the recovery of that money. And that really allowed co-ops to start to flourish in the rural areas across America. And let me just say that as a young CEO, which is really a long time ago, as a young CEO, I read a book by Robert Cairo about Lyndon Johnson, one of our early presidents. It's called Path to Power. But in that book, there's this remarkable chapter about how bringing electricity to Texas, to the farms and the ranches in Texas, transformed the lives of women. And think about it. They were carrying water from the well to the house. They were washing their clothes and hanging them out. You think about how they had to cook then. And you see a 30-year-old woman bent over, looking today like a woman would look at 55 or 60, from the hard work that they had to do during those times. And it transformed their lives, freed them up for more education, to work, to bring money into the family, to advance the family in their communities. So that has always been inspiration to me, because I always woke up every morning knowing that I was transforming the lives of millions of people by providing electricity to their homes and businesses. I felt it, I understood it, and I think we have to have that same feeling, because I think the greatest inequality in the world is those that have access to electricity and those that don't. And the people that are hurt the most by this inequality are women. And I go to these villages, I look at the work that's done. We need to have greater equality for women, and bringing electricity to these villages would do it. It would be a step towards solving the whole issue. I mean, they have 5 to 6 children for every family in sub-Saharan Africa. Educated women, if it is shown, will reduce the reproduction in that village in a way that's helpful to the growth of the village going forward. So that's one other piece of it that really made a difference. Now, let me just quickly go through government regulation, because one of the things that happened in about 1916, they set up a regulatory framework for investor-owned utilities regulated by the states. And that government action created an opportunity for the investment that was needed. The other important point is that this industry is the most capital intensive in the world. Think about the implications of that. Capital intensive industry. The industry's had to raise trillions of dollars over the 20th century. And this focus on affordability, the price of electricity from 1900 to 2000 fell 98% in real terms during that time. And they embraced a lot of technologies, not just in the operation and provision of electricity, but there was a lot of new technologies and new services created. Kind of hard for us to imagine new services, such as refrigeration services. Utilities didn't dictate buy a refrigerator. People made that choice of what services they want, so they went out, bought a refrigerator, and plugged it in. Same is true with washing and drying machines. They bought those machines, it provided that services, they plugged it in. Radio and TV, charging devices like cell phones and computers. All of those services came over time. The other remarkable thing about the services, they all improved in terms of energy efficiency from the day they were created to where they are today, and that's continuing with respect to each and every one of these services. But the point I want to make here is this concept of services was driven by new technologies. And it wasn't the utility that was driving this innovation of new technology. It's people creating the technologies and then plugging it in. What the utilities had to do was continuously upsize their system to meet the growing demand as it went further. Now, the last thing I would say is, the National Academy of Engineers got together in the end of the 20th century. They looked back and said, what was the single greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century? The guy that chaired it was a guy named Neil Armstrong. And by the way, he was on my board for 10 years. And by the way, when I needed his vote, I started my presentation by saying one small step. It sometimes got his vote, not always. But what they decided was the building of the grid in America was the greatest engineering achievement. Not putting a man on the moon, not cars, not the internet, not computers, but the grid, because the grid enabled all these things to happen that may not have happened but for the ability to enable all these technologies over time. And I think the important point is, it's a great innovation, more needs to be done, and actually today, billions of dollars are being spent to convert the grid from analog to digital. And that is a transformation that increases cyber risk, but also at the same time has the ability to communicate on the grid that's going to take electric service to a new place as we go forward. And I guess the last thing, well, I've been talking about affordable and reliable. Only in 1970 did we really start to focus in the US on environmental issues with the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And an important point here, to me, our standard of living had grown that whole time. And while the standard of living was growing, per capita income was going up. And actually, electricity today is only 3% of the disposable income of an average family of 4 in America. Because it was increasingly affordable going along. And I think the point I'm making here is it's got to be affordable, it's got to be reliable, and it's got to be clean. And carbon, I think, is one of the, and climate change is probably the greatest ecological crisis that we have. But a question we have to ask ourselves, would we build a coal plant to provide electricity, to lift people to middle class and above, to provide electricity 24/7 in one of these low-income countries? Would we be comfortable with increasing the carbon footprint of that community? And I think it's an issue of values. I think if you look at the per capita carbon footprint of Americans, so much higher in high-income countries than low-income countries. And so I want us to have a conversation about that, because there would be a real conflict. Do I make a bet on carbon and hold these people down? It doesn't have to be just coal. I think it has to be, coal could be a piece of it. Or do I put all my energy into the carbon issue and deny them access to electricity just because of the carbon issue? And I think that is a debate that's ongoing in a lot of different places. Now let me quickly turn, and I guess my point here is, the things that made the success of the electrification in America: government support, financing mechanisms in place with regulation, and you had, at the same time, you had increasing capability to pay as these new services and technologies came on. And the drive toward affordability made them affordable. And so there was a capability to pay for it as we went. And the technology improved throughout the century. And those, by the way, are the same four, if you remember at the beginning, are the four impediments to bringing electricity to the remote areas of the world. Now, let me just talk about something. I'm going to do this ever so quick. You know, I've been sitting here for 2 or 3 days going, social value, what in the hell is that? You know, I mean, I won't go around the room and ask people to give me a definition of social value. Because at my table, I've always said, well, what is social value? It seems kind of amorphous. It doesn't seem like it's measurable. It doesn't even seem real to me. And it's kind of an out-of-body experience. No, not quite that bad. But I thought about it, and here's kind of the way I kind of fit the concept of social value into my world. You know, most people think businesses are run solely for profitability, but not all businesses are, particularly the kind of business that I've been in. I personally believe, and I've lived it, I've approached running a business as taking a stakeholder approach. And you focus on creating value for each and every stakeholder. It's got to be measurable value, and you got to tell them about it. You got to share it with them. And when I say stakeholder approach, and by the way, I believe a stakeholder approach for a corporation is the only way to have a sustainable business model in the future. And what is stakeholder approach? First, for your customers, affordable, reliable, and clean electricity. For your communities, we work hard at attracting companies to bring jobs, high-paying jobs for the people in the communities we serve. We provide our people as leaders in local organizations, from the Chamber of Commerce to the opera to the ballet. We have foundations where we give money to the communities to help lift up their lives in those areas. So customers, communities, and your employees, you got to pay attention. You got to provide the right health care, the right wages. I think that's a very important part of a sustainable company. Of course, you have investors, and you got to produce right returns for them, but you have suppliers who depend on you for the growth of their business, for their livelihood, for you to continue to buy their products. And lastly, maybe should be first, is environment. Because the power sector has a greater impact on the environment than any single industry. When you think about what we burn to generate electricity, when you historically, although that's changing, you think about our distribution and transmission lines. So it's really important to be paying attention and leading on those important issues going forward. So I kind of reached the conclusion that in my world, social value is taking a stakeholder approach to running your enterprise. And quite frankly, a stakeholder approach doesn't just work for corporations, it works for NGOs. Because oftentimes NGOs get lost, and it's kind of on survival, and they should be lost for a while on survival, and they forget that part of their mission is to the greater group of stakeholders within the NGO framework. Now, here's where I've gone about 30 minutes, plus or minus, and now I want to open it up, and I want to have a conversation. Guys, I've kind of been preaching for a long time, too long. And I learn things when you ask questions. So here's my question. I said there are 4 things that are big impediments. Governments, what they do, what they don't do. Finance, capability to pay, and technology. Are there other impediments? Would you disagree with those 4? Would you rank them differently? Let's talk about it. I don't know how to turn it on. See, I'm a lawyer by trade. Hell, I know nothing about engineering. All right. Question? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Jim, for a wonderful, inspirational talk. I'll pick up on one point that you raised in your report, the financing challenge that we've talked about, others have talked about. We all understand the issues. Let me frame it in some whimsical way, and perhaps that might allow a decent discussion. So Clark mentioned the $99 billion sitting in the pool of global capital, earning perhaps less than 0.25%, if that, under current circumstances. That's a wonderful number if you think about it. You divide that 99 trillion by the billion we don't tell it, you've got $100,000 per person available as a pool of capital to transform this growth. So what is it that actually is an impediment in terms of collective global thinking to find a way to say, perhaps, can we find a way to use that capital to backstop, as you called it? The government used to provide a guarantee to the co-ops and so on. Could that unleash the solutions that are essentially not in play because of the financing issues?
That's a good question. I'd first say that in a respectful way, I disagree there's that much capital sitting on the sidelines at such low interest rates. Now, the stock market is overheated and the valuation's really high. If you're really smart, you pull in your money out and you're putting it in safer investments. So that phenomenon is clearly going on because of the overheated stock market. But the reality is nobody sits on their capital at such low interest rates. You should individually. Corporations don't. They invest their money or they give it back to the shareholder, which drives their share price. So I think they get dividends and they buy their stock back. So there's a lot more discipline in the market for the availability of capital. And the only way you attract capital is you offer a value proposition that I'm going to put $1 in this deal because I'm going to get 10 cents back at the end of the first year, 10 cents the next year, or 15 cents or 20 cents. And the greater your risk is, and think about the risk of rural electrification, the bigger return. So I don't want 10 or 15 cents back to put money in rural electrification. I want 50 cents back, or 25 cents back, or some higher number. Because the risk reward sort of translation is really important. I believe that the capital is there, but it's got to be with bankable projects. And there's got to be people, BrightLight, we require people to pay, but we subsidize what they have to pay because we know they can't afford it. And that requires people to give money to buy down the cost so they can get, a solar lantern is just the first rung on the ladder, but I know some people don't believe this, but I believe it's important to get people on that first rung. It's not as good as having 24/7 power, of course, but it's a step in the right direction. And anybody, I mean, you talked really eloquently yesterday about kerosene and the name of your company. I can't for the life of me remember. You should tell me. It's what?
No kerosene.
No kerosene, because kerosene is a bad thing in terms of inhalation as well as burning down. And actually, there's a burn unit in Guatemala with a number of people in it today as a consequence of trying to use kerosene within their home. So I think it's important to get the price right and recognize capability to pay. The money is there, but the government needs to see it. This is a role the government can play. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
In terms of the impediments, yeah. I think before that you mentioned are really ancillary. I mean, I think the impediment that we have to achieve energy democracy and the real social value of energy is our entrenched economic interests. And I'll use the old adagio, King Coal is not going to go easily, as we've seen. So I'd say that's the major impediment.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I would make one observation. 50% of electricity in the United States about 6 years ago came from coal. Today it's around 28%. And there's been nobody requiring it. What's really happened is utility industry has shut down those plants because they have reduced their carbon footprint 28% since '05, which puts them ahead of plan to meet the Clean Power Plant rule, even though the rule is not in place. So the industry sees that carbon is going to be priced and regulated, and they are moving in that direction. So utilities are not entrenched, and we know that presidents come and go. We'll be here when they go. And we know that we're going to have to ultimately do this as a matter of judgment. And so we're in the process of doing it. Now the coal industry is kind of starting to sell their coal outside the U.S. So entrenched interests, I get your point, but they're not as dominant as you might think if you've got a good government, you've got good consumer groups, and you've got support for taking them on. Yes, ma'am. Get an exercise.
I really enjoyed your talk on and telling us about the history of the United States and electrification. You talked about the role of the government in providing electricity and matching on companies. And I wanted to talk about how the regulation and privatization of electric utilities in the United States has changed the way electricity is provided. And also, in sub-Saharan Africa, that's happened as well. Most of the utilities have been privatized. And you talked about Tanzania putting a tax on solar panels. I don't know what their reasons are, probably for profit making. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the right model of a utility, if any, in providing electricity access and the role of privatization.
That's a really good and tough question. I think in the U.S. what you have is a hybrid system. Only 19 states have moved to competitive markets. The remainder are still vertically integrated and regulated. And we were moving in the direction of competitive markets, and then it just stopped about 2000. And it really, because of the implosion of natural gas markets, electric commodity markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it just stopped. And what you find in the United States is, part of it had to do, the states that moved to competition are states that were high priced. The low price states never wanted to move there because what can we gain from it? It was driven primarily by industrial customers who wanted lower prices. Now, what the industrial customers have done is migrate from one part of the country to prices where the prices are low, and that's been part of the answer. But the reality is we are stuck with competitive market states. I mean, it's really more complicated than that. There's probably 4 different models in the US. Those 2 are kind of at the state level. Then there's just a few states like the South that are not, they're still vertically integrated and they're not in RTOs, or regional transmission organizations, because they didn't want the federal government to touch their transmission, even though the federal government has some authority over it. But because they were able to do that because the prices are so low. They have to be low in the South because and it's probably true in the Southwest, the prices have to be low because the air conditioning load is so huge. And so if you're going to have a right price for consumers, you know the volume would be big, so the price has got to be low based on capability to pay. So I think we're stuck, and in Africa, there has been a movement in that direction, but virtually every utility in Africa, except in Uganda, is owned by the government. And so their inability to raise capital is really tied to the low credit ratings of the country. So they haven't been able to raise the capital to invest in the grids. And same is true in India, but the same problem associated with not enough investment in the grid. And how do I say this in a polite way? There is no polite way, but the corruption is huge. And as a consequence, we heard the story of Puerto Rico last night, a remarkable story, but that's a story of corruption. That's a story of failure to carry out the mission of the government to reinvest in the grid, to maintain it, to operate it in an efficient way, because people were skimming off the top, putting their best friends into work. That just doesn't work. Scott?
So a similar question, and I think the historical analogy is interesting here. So as you mentioned in the early turn of the century, one reason that the utilities, investor-owned utilities, were able to succeed was from vertical integration. When you had this rapid technological improvement, a new provider could undercut the cost of the old and they'd go bankrupt. So that's when you don't have a big infrastructure base where that vertical integration was important. We're in a similar situation in new electricity access. But probably instead of scaling plants with lower unit costs, we're looking at this pathway from maybe solar home system, microgrid, centralized grid. So I'm playing out the analogy in my head, and maybe unbundling isn't the answer right now. Or is there a way that you can guarantee that those first solar home systems or maybe microgrids don't go out of business when the new connection comes in? And is vertical integration or economy of scope going to help? Or is there another way? One difference is that some of those assets are movable. Solar home systems can be redeployed, and some of the assets in the microgrids can. So that's a little different than the fixed assets in the other case. But I don't know, so I'm putting that out there.
No. When I wrote my book in 15, I really said the solution for rural, at least to start, because it's going to take a long time for the grid to get to a lot of these places, that the solution was solar and going up the solar ladder. And I think the way to think about it in a smart way is the government should have certain requirements for microgrids, or mini grids, so that they, when the grid is extended, if ever, it can connect to the grid. And there ought to be provisions that said how if the utility is going to then run them, how they pay the owner of the mini grid. And even with solar ladders, there's a place for that technology, but we need to be thinking about how we ultimately integrate it all. I have limited hope that the governments will empower the state-owned utilities in a way. I mean, they can privatize them, and maybe then they can raise the money, but still, at the end of the day, people that loan money will look at the credit quality of the government. So, I mean, that's kind of the conundrum. But I think the ability to start with, what's different in America, we were in a period where we didn't have solar and wind. We maybe dreamed about it, but we didn't have it. And bigger plants, lower cost. Now you have solar panels, prices coming down, efficiency improving, storage technology, which is really the key. But I remember what Thomas Edison said about storage in 1985. He said the creation of storage will transform the power sector, and its development is just around the corner. In a damn long big corner. We're not there yet with it, but we're on the way. Simon?
Thanks, Jim, for a really interesting presentation again. I just wanted to add to your four impediments of policy, finance, capacity to pay, and technology. My fifth one would be clarity of ambition. And I guess that was what I was trying to talk about in my presentation at the beginning of the week. We have this global SDG 7, which talks about universal access. But the nature of that access is not clear at all. At the global level, we're talking about tier 1, we're talking about tier 5, we're talking about power and livelihood or just domestic lighting. And I think that plays through to national policy making sometimes. A couple of years ago, while I was still at Practical Action, we brought together people from across the energy sector in Zimbabwe just for a discussion on what the sort of key policy blockages were there. And we talked a little bit about why, particularly solar and other forms of renewables weren't really kicking off in rural areas. And there are a number of reasons that give that. One of them I thought was really interesting. It was that there was a sense of that if, among some people, there was a sense in villages that if they accepted a solar-based technology that gave a limited sort of level of energy services, maybe some lighting, maybe some small appliances, that they would somehow, in the eyes of government, be ticked off and being served. That sense that there wasn't that sort of height of ambition to actually provide goods. So people were sitting it out and waiting and seeing whether the grid would come. So I just wanted to see if you think that's an attitude.
I think aspiration, particularly of the government and the people, is really important, and I would add that. But I would say this, I say, there's an argument, there's a woman in Berkeley called Catherine Wolfer. And she makes the argument that having a little bit of electricity is not enough for economic growth and development of community. It takes having the same quality of electricity access as you have in the high-income countries. So from an aspirational standpoint, every one of these countries should aspire to use renewables, but they should also aspire to have the same level of access as high-income countries around the world, and they shouldn't stop with one solar lantern in every home. Mark?
So I guess I don't fundamentally disagree with your list of four impediments, but I do think that it's a bit problematic in terms of identifying solutions, in the sense that many of those issues are tied up in government problems and poor governance. Even the capability to pay is ultimately a development issue, which is very much tied up in government policy. And I think perhaps it glosses over a little bit the importance of other institutional structures. And you added as your maybe afterthought or your fifth this issue of human capacity. I think I would broaden that perhaps to thinking about institutional development and micro-institutional structures more broadly. Because your cooperative story kind of backs this up, that not all of this is going to be sort of national or even regional government-led policy that sort of enables a change. It's actually sort of collective action and cooperation between people that's enabled by micro-institutions that sort of have some ability to make changes at a broader scale. Two reasons why I think this is particularly important in most low-income rural contexts that we're talking about struggling with energy access. So markets are very thin in these places. They're hard to get to, costs are high. This is the cooperative story, right? It's very expensive to provide these kinds of services. And so these micro-institutions really play, they're essentially the only suppliers in these places because the private sector is going to be slow to get there. And then the other reason I think this is very important is because government policy in and of itself is endogenous or depends on development. So, as long as people are not empowered and are able to save time, get more education, get involved in productive activities, they don't have the capacity to require their government to improve. So that there has to be some initial progress before the government is going to actually respond to improvements. And we know all around the world that inequality breeds governmental problem, governmental inaction, government failure. So that's just what I was.
And I should say I agree with all of that. I made one observation, I think it was brought up earlier, about co-ops. Co-ops didn't start in the United States with a bunch of people sitting around the table and saying, let's have a co-op. It started with federal legislation. And by the way, that was maybe the biggest role that the federal government played. Virtually all regulation of the development of the power sector in the United States was not done at the federal level, but state by state. That's why it's so daggone complicated in the U.S., because every state has different regulatory regimes, different approaches. I mean, states like Indiana have access to coal, states like California don't. So they develop a whole thing around maybe natural gas, maybe other alternatives. So while people take positions that look like they're ideological positions, they're really grounded in the availability of resources and how the states actually structure the regulation. So you need to, when people are making ideological arguments, you need to go back and say, well, do they have access to resources? What are the underlying things? But I think your point's right, but co-ops were a top-down thing, not a bottom-up. And that's the way it worked in the US, and I'm not so sure having people sit around the table of it in itself creates the funding backstop, blah, blah, blah. So I think the government has to play a role. One more question?
Thank you very much for your talk. It's a good talk when in the process of delivering it, the same things you pointed out as pitfalls at one point in time, if you go back in history, those same things enable the evolution of electric systems. I had to make a comment, but on the way to my point. I feel that corruption is a team sport. and to vote bi-directional, because it's then we might be falling into the trap of ideology by pointing at corruption as the single factor that describes a very complex situation. And I'm going through this comment to your idea of a stakeholder society or a stakeholder model, which I very much ascribe. But some of us that study governance from a political science and public admin background are quick to point out that it is only if that stakeholder arrangement is based on equality and justice in terms of distributional justice and procedural justice, that those processes will start to give fruit. Now, one arena where that really plays out, and it plays out in my country, is in the corporate governance of utility or boardrooms. And in my country, the party in power puts the finger on the members of the utility board. And that board virtually changes every 4 years, or every time there is a change in political party in administration. Imagine that environment, decision-making environment. Now, how would you envision you run a board in a stakeholder model that actually is representative in the decision-making process of utilities of the single mom or of the member of a low-income community or the pastor or the barber, when we live in an environment where we want to professionalize boards, utility boards, we legislate that, actually. You need to be an attorney, you need to be an electrical engineer to be on the board. I think we have a long way to go, and I'm with you on that path. Looking at stakeholder, flat, hierarchical, really polycentric way of making decisions about a country's energy system. But in our boardrooms still, if you look at the demographics of our boardrooms, they still have a long way to go to get there. I think I want to hear your impression.
No, I agree with that. I mean, actually, the stakeholder approach really was, European countries have done this probably before in the US. And they have really done it with a greater demand. They have greater diversity on the boards. Not just diversity in terms of gender, but diversity in terms of experience. And I think they're moving in that direction. And I think that's really important. But you talk about having different, my whole life has been a life of having new commissions. I mean, you have to start all over and start to educate every new commission that comes in. You get a new governor, he appoints new people, and you got to start all over. So it's a continuous, I used to say my title is not the CEO, but it's Chief Educational Officer. I have to educate regulators, I have to educate investors, I have to educate our employees, I have to educate to what we're striving to achieve. But it's kind of a repetitive thing. You know, and after you have the fourth regulatory commission, you say to yourself, God, I'm tired of starting at dirt and rebuilding the story. But you have to, because they recruit people that don't know anything about the business. And that's the problem also. If you get a barber, the problem, I mean, he might be well-intentioned and a smart person, but at the end of the day, he might not be the best one to make informed decisions about the future of the power system.
Maybe we can move to technical advisory committees that could then.
Could. But, I mean, that's why I was a consumer advocate. I got in these cases to try to argue that we needed the rates lower. And in that forum, you've got different ideas presented to the different deliberative bodies of the commission. Clark, before I go, I want to ask one question of the group, and maybe it's just a vote by your hands. How many people think access to electricity should be a basic human right?
Somebody take a picture.
I think I see everybody. Quick last hand. After translation. All right. Well, we ought to be supporting that, because if the UN adopted it, it increases the probability that the low-income countries will make policies that reflect that reality. Thank you all very much.